mention in Levinas studies, the worldliness, as Levinas sets it up, this would be the equivalent with his account of being in the world, which is so important in Heidegger, and as I said, is the breakthrough thinker and set the pattern of what one would think about. Okay. This will all be on the web, as it turns out. It'll all be broadcast on the web, but you're welcome to look at this. Oh, okay. Oh, okay, good. Yeah.
He's speaking.
People feel away. I'm afraid it might explode. It's terrible thing. So, today, I want to go into this section on immanence, dwelling, habitation, the home, possession, labor, the body, freedom, representation, economy. And at the same time, I'm going to try to, I probably won't be able to, but I'll steer a little bit clear of the topic of the feminine presence, because Nicole will be leading us in a discussion this afternoon on that, and Igor will be leading a discussion on labor and the body, and Cindy will be discussing something else coming up with this phenomenon being distinction. I may touch upon them, but I'll probably steer a little bit here. Lin Ma left us with the question, what is this notion of a muted alterity? It seems as if we have to go right from the self-sensing, the enjoyment, the happiness, the carefreeness, to the shock, the trauma of the other. Now, we do go directly to the shock, the trauma of the other, because remember, everything is operative all at once, although not at the same time. When I say not at the same time, I do mean all at once, but out of phase. Right? I'm referring to diachrony. But at the same time, Levinas has this notion of feminine presence. So let me take just a little aside excursion to something that I don't know if I fully understand, but I think is important, that he talks about here. This method of concretization, page 153. And I want to, it also is on 173. And we'll go to both of them, because Lin also raises the question of method. We know Levinas's method is the phenomenological method, but there seems to be a great deal of flexibility, not a great deal, but there's some flexibility as to what that means, the phenomenological method. It became one thing in Heidegger's hands. Who is the most faithful phenomenologist? It's hard to discern. In my book, it's Levinas and Merleau-Ponty. But remember, and for Levinas, in these poles of thinking that could be abstract or concrete, or tending toward idealism, or tending toward existentialism, Levinas favors the existentialist reading. Not that he's an existentialist like Sartre, he's a different sort of existentialist, an ethical existentialist. So he names his book articles on Heidegger and Husserl, discovering existence with Husserl and Heidegger, laying emphasis on the concretude of phenomenology. And his celebrated book on Husserl that won a prize, published in 1930 when he was 24 years old, they could kill him for the theory of intuition in Husserl's phenomenology emphasizes intuition as the key, because this is Bergson's idea that Husserl then develops, everything in Bergson is developed in Husserl, the intuition into the things themselves, the fulfillment in a seeing, right? A seeing of the essence, a very strange idea. Not just a cognizing, but a kind of seeing. And Husserl favors the perceptual metaphors. So I don't know if I can explain it, but I'd like to look at it, because twice here, in the midst of his phenomenology, this is the strongest phenomenology we find anywhere in Levinas, this section 2 of the Total Infinity. He says in the middle of page 153, a specific intentionality of concretization we can formulate it in this way, when he's talking about habitation in the dwelling. The consciousness of the world is already conscious through the world. Right? The consciousness of the world is already conscious through the world. Now that's a Merleau-Pontian idea, but the interesting thing, and I know you'll accuse me of simply being a Levinausian, is that Levinas and Merleau-Ponty developed these ideas of embodiment at the same time. It's not that Levinas is reading Merleau-Ponty and just appropriating it, or that Merleau-Ponty is reading Levinas. They are developing a very similar notion of embodiment simultaneously. This happens. And as we know, Merleau-Ponty grounds himself in ontology and politics and history, and Levinas grounds himself in ethics and morality and then justice. So the consciousness of the world is already consciousness through the world. So what Levinas is concerned with, and we'll see this later when we talk about representation, is the primacy of representation in Husserl. This is one of the things that Levinas will fall to Husserl for. It's a heritage of Kant, it's a heritage of thinking itself. There's people say, no matter what you say, that you can insert the I think before whatever it is you say. Right? Not in the sense of, oh, that's my subjective opinion. We say that in common language. We say, oh, I think this, it's just my opinion, but not. But in the sense of grounding it as a cognition, we can say this is a product of consciousness. So when Husserl thinks of all conscious life as intentional consciousness, consciousness of something, he interprets it in this traditional Kantian way of the I think, of an apperception, of a transcendental apperception. Now we'll see later that makes sense in terms of what representation is, but one has to struggle against it to be true to the phenomena. And the struggle against the insertion of the I think and the representational character of what it brings us is what Levinas is calling this method of concretization. Now the danger is we think, where did Levinas get this idea of dwelling in the home? Well, he lives in bourgeois France, right? So people have homes. What if he grew up in another country? Would he be saying the same thing? Well, Levinas would like to think that yes, he would be saying the same thing. That is, he wants, this is a phenomenology, this is a science, this is not just this is a objective opinion. On the other hand, so we would say, just as in Kant, this is an analogy I want to make, Kant's philosophy is designed for rational beings. It so happens the only rational beings he knows of on this planet are humans. So often you see this anthropology coming. For instance, humans want to be happy. Oh, geez, humans want to be happy, right? And so he'll make concessions to that and talk about religion. But he's not interested really in that. He's interested in rational beings from whatever planet they're from, anywhere in the universe. They could read Kant and get it. Levinas is interested, I would say, in any embodied beings. Any embodied beings. So when we see these science fiction movies of beings coming from out of space, insofar as they are embodied, insofar as they have self-sensing, Levinas's analysis would apply. Or not. Now maybe I'm going too far, but I think it's something to think about in terms of this being a science. I might be going too far, because I'm thinking, we know in the animal world, in terms of this dwelling, yes, humans have this long period of child rearing, but the little gooky kid can't function, and you have to take care of it. And it's a child for the longest time. But turtles lay an egg in the sand, and the little turtle pops out. They don't even know who its mother is. They're the coolest, right? Or if you've ever raised goldfish, guppies, they don't know who each other are. The mommy eats the kids. The kids eat their brothers and sisters. They have no clue. So in what sense does a guppy have a dwelling? Maybe it doesn't have to, because Levinas is concerned with ethical beings. So the ethical being, perhaps there is this need for this dwelling, this holding environment. But we'll see. Also, it's probably related, as we know, to possession. So I don't want to get too carried away with the analogy of rational being versus embodied being. Because when we say embodied being, ultimately what Levinas wants to mean is full, rich, ethical life, what it is to be human. So this intentionality of concrete, consciousness of a world already conscious through the world, something of that world seen as an organ or an essential means of vision, the head, the eye, the eyeglasses, the light, the lamp, the books, the school. The whole of the civilization of labor and possession arises as a concretization of the separated being effectuating its separation. But this civilization refers to the incarnation of the consciousness and to habitation, to existence proceeding from the intimacy of a home, the first concretization. The very notion of an idealist subject has come from a failure to recognize this overflowing of concretization. So concretization is going to be his term when he speaks of methodology, of how to overcome the trick of representation, which we will see is the anterior posteriorly, right? Crucial concept, the after the fact of representation. Representation is what I call, and again, this terminological distinction we'll get to that I wish Levinas had made. If we think of representation as seeking the origin of things, then what it does is it does an origin prior to the beginning, and it pretends there was no beginning. And the beginning is the concrete. We begin in the concrete. Representation then shows you retrospectively the origin of the concrete, as if there was no beginning. Genius. And that's the temptation of idealism. You're pulling yourself up with your bootstraps. So that after the fact, everything is, we'll get to them. I'm jumping ahead of myself. We'll get to representation. And this is also an idea that Levinas gets from Bergson and develops it much further than Bergson. So let's go concretization to page 153. 153, the middle of page, 173, I'm sorry, 173. It says, the method practiced here, and I'm saying, I'm not sure I fully understand, I'm giving the best shot as I understand this thing. The method practiced here does indeed consist in seeking the condition of empirical situations, but it leaves the development called empirical, in which the conditioning possibility is accomplished. It leaves to the concretization an ontological role that specifies the meaning of the fundamental possibility, a meaning invisible in that condition. So, he's trying to break free of the Kantian notion of the transcendental condition for the possibility of. Levinas is saying you cannot separate out the condition for the possibility of when you're dealing with the concrete. That is, you can separate the condition for the possibility of when you're dealing in representational thought, as Kant does. But when you're saying, what's the condition for the possibility of labor? Well, the thing that conditions labor is going to involve labor. It's not going to be separate from it. But it will be a condition, but it's a material, we call today a material condition. And Levinas is calling it the concrete. So there's, as it were, no full stepping out, so that the epoche, as it were, as Merleau-Ponty points out, this is Merleau-Ponty's whole new teaching in the introduction to the phenomenology of perception, is that the reduction is never complete. Right? That's his discovery about Husserl. The reduction, Husserl's going on and on about completing the reduction, purifying the reduction, getting to pure consciousness. And then Merleau-Ponty said, this process itself is part of being conscious, the purification of consciousness. It never reaches the end. Also a way of overcoming Kant. Right? For Kant, he separates the conditions from the conditioning, and then shows the aporia that occur when you do that. But Husserl doesn't want to do that. It goes forever. It's interminable in Husserl. Right? Every year there's a new reduction. Right? The transcendental reduction, transcendental philosophical reduction. Right? Anyway, and I think that's what's up in this method of concretization, is the reduction in the phenomenological sense is never complete, and the consequences of the incompletion of that reduction in terms of laying out a philosophy. So instead of criticizing things and saying, oh, you're dragging in the empirical, you're mistaking the empirical for the essential, he's saying you can't separate the empirical and the essential. Right? Now, maybe I'm wrong, But, yes.
I think they're perfectly right.
Okay.
And
I love this guy. I love him.
well, I'm not always like that.
Oh, okay.
And I think that what Levinas is trying to say here is that you have to start with the sensible. You have to start with the concrete and go beyond it. But start with it, and not start from an idea and then try to understand the concrete. In Heidegger, there's a difference, which I think is parallel to this difference, is the difference between the ontical and the ontological level. So the ontical level would be the level of concretization.
Right.
And every ontological structure is based and can only be understood when one departs from this point, from the ontical level. So there's an interconnection between these levels, as in Levinas here. They cannot be taken apart. They cannot function apart from one another. And the basic level is the empirical level, is the ontical level.
So what we're going to have to see to pursue your thought, because actually you'll see Levinas is going to actually talk about that in the sentence before, the one I read, exactly what you're talking about, is we're going to ask ourselves, to what extent can we maintain, to what extent can we not maintain a parallel between the difference of saying and said in Levinas and being and beings, or the ontological difference in Heidegger. And we'll see that they are radically different. And Levinas is constantly reminding us of the radical difference. But you're right, to this extent we can think of a parallel, although Levinas will attempt in some instances to speak about saying as pure saying, and he warns us constantly about the said as pure said, and therefore the link between them, but he can sort of go on either side and speak more when telling us how the said works, how the saying works. They're always linked, however. There is no saying without a said, there's no said without a saying. In the same way for Heidegger, as we pointed out, is the ontological is his real interest, but the ontic doesn't go away. It's not abstracted out, but it's that difference where meaning is coming from. So if you look at the previous sentence on page 173, before he talks about his method, he's going to distinguish it from Heidegger. Constantly doing it. In fact, I think you could, what percentage of, this is Merleau-Ponty does this too, what percentage of Levinas is stuff he doesn't think? I'm running it somewhere around 60%, right? 60%, he's telling us stuff that this is not what I think. You know, Merleau-Ponty's about 60% also. You know, and Heidegger's not so different as they go on and on about what I do not think. Right? So here's a case of what he does not think. Our work in all its developments, well, that's a pretty big opening, strives to free itself from the conception that seeks to unite events of existence, I would call that the ontic, affected with opposite signs in an ambivalent condition, that's a code word for ontological difference, so strives to free itself from the conception it seeks to unite events of existence affected with opposite signs in an ambivalent condition which alone would have ontological dignity, while the events themselves, proceeding in one direction or another, would remain empirical, articulating nothing ontologically new. So he's saying, all of my work is to prevent us from thinking of the difference between said and saying as the difference between being and beings, as the ontic and the ontological. He's refusing that difference. Okay. So it must be a huge temptation, right? Remember, when I say it's a huge temptation in this beginning of contemporary thought, which is the epoch we live in. Right? We're just taking our first baby steps in post-dualist thinking. So, no question, we're tempted by the fall back into Kant and Augustine and Aquinas and all of this nonsense, right? Which Levinas will characterize ultimately as childish, right? But in terms of taking our first adult steps, the figure that's going to tempt us most is the one who took the strides in that way, Heidegger. Right? So he's most careful about, it's always the ones closest to you that you have to be concerned about. Unless I'm misreading that sentence, that's how I read that sentence. Yeah. That it's saying this will not be Heidegger. And this is the difference. I do not consider the empirical as ontic, he's saying.
But what
How
how
to
make
concern him with Merleau-Ponty then?
Because Mel,
According to that, then they are just, Levinas is still Levinas. So.
in fact, your question is perfect. The difference with Merleau-Ponty is
yes,
Merleau-Ponty did not succeed in freeing himself from Heidegger. Merleau-Ponty is ultimately Heideggerian.
Yeah, so
He is, yeah.
so from I think it's because it's the concretization for me it's relational. That's how he is different from Merleau-Ponty. It's not about sensation. It's about the relation with the other. It's from the beginning. It's not like for you, like said, it's the sense or whatever. For me, it's relational. That's how he is different from Merleau-Ponty.
Ultimately, the difference will be the ethical character of the relationality. Yes, there's no question. That's where he gets this, everything comes out different because of
Because
that.
next paragraph is going to be
Right. This is true, but when he steps back to talk about his method and how he wants to characterize the upshot of that difference, he will put it in these terms, I think. So that when he talks about labor, he ultimately, yes, it will be in the context of insult. You can see it. It's by the end of this section, it's like we're tearing at the bit to get into the face of the other. Which you couldn't restrain yourself yesterday. But, it's just like unleashed. It's like, and there's a second way you see this, Levinas do. It's not just the unleashing of the other. He teases us. One of his great ways of writing is he doesn't talk about ethics. It's the not talking about ethics. And you're sitting there going, I can't believe you said this and this and this. And what we know you mean is responsibility for the other. And he'll talk about non-indifference and vulnerability and disturbance. And so it's no question, you're right. But there is a lot of phenomenology that's being done here. And so how is it different? And he wants to say this concretization, I think, is the difference. It would have been easy for him. This is, Buber fell into this trap. Everything I, thou, everything I, thou. I shouldn't say that. Buber's actually a very good philosopher. But his I, thou isn't very good. But you know that there are people who they have a little idea and they trot it out every single time. Whereas Levinas plays with holding back this great idea, I think. That's the beauty in his text. You think, I know what you're going to say. I know where you're going. I know what's behind this. And he just concretizes, and then bam, you get it. Right? Because it's always operative. That shock is operative. Okay, so what? Did you want to comment further?
I want to pick this phrase again, and I think your interpretation is right, but I think there can be another interpretation possible.
Okay, of that sentence. Okay, read it to us in another interpretation.
Our work in all its developments strives to free itself from the conception that seeks to unite events of existence, and yet it's important, affected with opposite signs. That means by Heidegger you can find this figure of thought all over the place. The negation of something reveals that something.
Right.
When something doesn't work, you understand the being of that.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, the breakdown.
Yeah. There are many moods of being, but they're all reducible to the mood, to the Befindlichkeit, even if they're contrary to each other. So, what Levinas is saying here is that he seeks to avoid, to unite events of existence affected with opposite sign in an ambivalent condition. This is the condition of Befindlichkeit, for example, the condition of mood, which accounts for both despair and joy and so on.
What you're saying, Levinas wants to do that?
No, Levinas doesn't want to do that.
Got it.
Levinas is trying to avoid to
Yes,
do what
avoid doing
Heidegger,
that. Yes.
does,
Yes, yes.
namely to unite events of existence affected with opposite signs
Mhm.
in this ambivalent condition, which alone would have ontological dignity. Because this is his problem. The problem is that by Heidegger, only the Befindlichkeit, only the mood has an ontological
Yes.
dignity, but the other moods don't have an ontological
Right.
dignity. And
Right.
this is what he's,
Exactly.
he's trying to avoid.
Right.
And then he goes on and says, while the events themselves proceeding in one direction or another would remain empirical, articulating nothing ontologically new. So for him, everything is articulating something ontologically new. This is his point.
It potentially could, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So he's used the word concrete, he's deliberate. He's saying, ultimately, my approach is more concrete than Heidegger.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because Heidegger's reducing things to the
Yeah,
ontological.
it's reducing things with different signs, with
Yeah.
the opposite signs, to an ambivalent condition,
Right.
which can be different, but let's take the Befindlichkeit.
Right.
But I'm not going to do this because this leaves the empirical aside, a part of it.
In other words, you could say, as I was trying to say, that Heidegger has imported an existential version of the Kantian condition for the possibility, because he loses sight of what it is that's conditioned in the conditioning of it. Yes, absolutely, that's how I think it should be read. Yeah. So that's, I just wanted to start with that. Let me see. Okay, a little bit fragmented here. I want to go to page 162. Okay, substance. Okay, the extraterritoriality of a home. This is the bottom of the paragraph that has already started on page 162. The extraterritoriality of a home. This is a middle position between the enjoyment and what we're going to see is labor and representation, right? The extraterritoriality of the home conditions the very possession of my body. Now remember, the body has two sides too. One is the happy enjoyment, the carefree, free floating, and the other is fear for the morrow, right? This is insecure. This is no way to live. You're going to die. You're exposed to the elements. Yes, I love the sun, and then you're sunburned and fractured wrist. Substance refers to the dwelling, that is, in the etymological sense of the term. He didn't have to do that, since everything is in the etymological sense. The economy. So what is the etymological economy? It's a house, the management of a house. Yeah. Oikos, the house, and nomos, in this case meaning the management, house management, household management. So that made me think of the beginning of Aristotle's Politics. It's very interesting. I already mentioned yesterday that just as Aristotle, you can't go to Aristotle's Politics without his ethics. Right? One leads right to the other. Levinas is exactly the same. His ethics, or what I call his morality, right, leads directly to a theory of justice. They're inseparable. And Aristotle begins the Politics discussing household management. It's very interesting that he does that. And I was forced to think about it in the last presidential election in the United States, where a peculiar thing happened, which is going to happen more and more often in our world, I'm afraid. There was a politician, Obama, running against, not a politician, a businessman. It's a very strange phenomenon. A businessman was running for president of the United States. His qualifications were that he had been successful in business. And he was a very wealthy man. And Aristotle specifically warns people at the beginning of the Politics about exactly the danger of a business person running for a political office. It's fascinating. So he discusses, where does business make sense? Business makes sense in household management. That is, if you overspend what you make, you're going to go broke, you'll be thrown out of your house. But he also, Aristotle cautions, and I don't think Aristotle and Levinas have the same idea of business. I think Levinas is much more favorable to business. Aristotle is not, because he has that Greek aristocratic prejudice. There's something wrong with business and making money. Levinas does not have that view. But I think they share this, that Aristotle, his point is, the values that it takes to be a successful business person, which is, a keen sense of making profit, right, are exactly what disqualify you from being a politician. Because the values of a politician are care for the commonwealth, right? Care for the public good. Whereas the values of a business person are care for my own economy, my household, right? So for Aristotle, it's a distortion to spend too much time on business. All you need to do is spend just enough to keep your household going. That's enough, right? And again, I don't think Levinas would agree with that, but I don't think we would get too far away from that. That is, ultimately, Levinas is not going to be supporting as the ultimate life, the life of a business person. But I think it's interesting when he refers explicitly to the term in its etymological sense. It's a kind of go further with this. Since he's constantly doing this, using terms in an etymological sense. So I think especially he's alerting to this discussion. If I don't want to get carried away with Levinas being aware of everything, but I don't think it's a stretch to relate it to this discussion of the household. Also, by bringing this up, it in some way tames this thinking, because you would say, wow, Levinas. Dwelling, the house, where does this come in? Later Gaston Bachelard writes a book about it, and it's wonderful. But who's talking this way? Aristotle's talking this way. This is how Aristotle begins his politics. The household, right? Household management, right? Get your house in order. And then you can go run for political office. Right? Did you find that, just as an aside, a little peculiar about the American election? Or is this what we expect from America today? Maybe this is what we expect.
Well, we had Ronald Reagan on that.
Well, he was an actor. He was an actor, that's right. You're right. We had Ronald Reagan, so anything is possible. It's a democracy. Yeah. Okay, so let's continue with this, the household. We're going to talk about the feminine presence, but why is the household so important for Levinas? The household is important because you need a place of refuge to put things. You can't, for Levinas, the original thing is property. Right? The thingness of the thing is not instrumentality by itself. It's property, it's mine. Levinas then has this theory, I'll read it, because it is not in itself, right? Because the thing is for me, I own it. And by the way, this will lead to what Sadie's going to talk about, the difference between phenomena and being for Levinas. The difference between phenomena and being comes from, this is my possession. It's no longer in itself. What is this thing? Mine. So we're not talking about what it is. It's in relation to me. It's a phenomena now. Right? As for its being, I could care less. That's for scientists. Right? So it has phenomenal being. It's mine. It's not someone else's. So because it is not a thing, it's not in itself a thing, it can be exchanged and accordingly be compared and quantified, and consequently already lose its very identity, be reflected in money. It's an incredible view here. He's saying that exchange value is already implicit in use value, or in possession. Right? So exchange value doesn't wait for capitalism. Right? Capitalism may be the exacerbation of exchange value. It may be the universalization of it, the commodification of the world. But Levinas is rooting exchange value, that is something is valuable because it can be quantified and exchanged with a kind of primordial phenomenology of what it means to be an embodied being in the world with a dwelling and possessions. Right? Very different analysis than Marx. Right? So instead of analyzing it downward from the political economic structure, he's working this way upward from embodiment. right? So that the embodied being entering into the system will have an independence from the economic political system already. I mean, this is the upshot of enjoyment itself, right? The point of enjoyment, separation from the totality. A being is a being unto itself. But now we're saying possession too is separate from the larger structure. On the other hand, it's not separate, right? Because now that I have possessions, I can make gifts. Now that I have possessions, I can exchange them with others. So the other is beating on the door here, right? The other's here, the other's in. It's too late. It's always too late. The other's already there. But we're beginning to get glimpses of the other, right? It's beginning to intrude in our analysis. Right?
Can we have an exchanging relationship with the other, with Kant? Then it's not the other one.
That's not that.
Yeah, then we
Yeah.
can only have the ethical.
Right. Here Kant was right. You know, the difference in dignity and price. Right? To treat the other as a commodity, having a price, would be to reduce the other to the set.
Yeah. So it's still in something still interesting.
Right. Yeah. And you see this again in our increasingly bureaucratized and our world, where the economies of scale have by themselves, it seems, a dehumanizing dimension, where we're treated as numbers and anonymously. You call the phone of the company and you're talking to someone in India or in Brazil, and they're pretending. I mean, they're up at 4 o'clock in the morning talking. And you wonder, how can they do this? Right? It's brutal that someone has to do this. So we're increasingly somehow becoming anonymous, but look at us. Of course, this would be a violation that, in some way necessary. In some way necessary, insofar as the state and institutions are necessary, it's something that we have to constantly guard against. I think one of the great contributions of Kant is the difference between price and dignity. You know, everything either has a price or it has dignity. So a property, a merchandise can be bought and sold. A thing is revealed in the market as susceptible of belonging, being exchanged, and accordingly as convertible into money, susceptible of dispersing in the anonymity of money. Look at the boldness of this thinking, right? Here's the great ethical philosopher. He's talking about money.
It's very interesting because he criticizes both Marxism and capitalism in the same phrase.
Yes.
He criticizes Marxism because Marxism doesn't allow property to exist, so there's no belonging, so the things have no value. And he criticizes capitalism because through the money, the things disappear. The things.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. The sense of possession disappears through exchange value. Yeah.
So he's, in one phrase, he's criticizing two opposite understandings of economy and of.
I know. He really carves out his own order. He really creates a total worldview here. I was looking for this sentence where he does say something about the proletariat, which was interesting relative to what we were saying yesterday. I don't know if someone noticed it, because he relates it immediately to the bourgeois. Where is this? Does anyone remember the sentence with the proletariat and the bourgeois?
I think it's 140 and
140.
something.
What was it? Oh, is that me? Everyone I know is here. What do? I just sorry. Yeah. I don't know how that could happen.
The others come.
Well, I hope it's not one of my kids. Maybe I should have. Okay, so we're going to bump into it.
Bottom of 146.
Oh, thank you. Bottom of 146. 146. Oh, no, but this we did yesterday, the proletarian condition.
Yeah.
No, this was a new one, where he will talk about getting out of the proletarian condition, but then he doesn't want them to fall into the bourgeois self-indulgence, right? He's criticizing bourgeois self-indulgence. And I was thinking about what Paul was saying about he's steering a path between Marxism and capitalism. Page 179. 179. And this relates to what Victor, we were talking about, you were saying about comfort becoming the standard. In some way it is the standard, but if it's the only standard, it's this, he says, for the totality of contentment to reveal the 179, the paragraph, the second paragraph, and its inadequateness to the absolute, it does not suffice that a discontent be substituted for contentment. Right? Discontent still remains within the horizon of a totality as its indigence, which in need anticipates its satisfaction. So the discontent or the restlessness of the ethical condition is not just, I want more food, I want more, a bigger house. It's not that. So it says, such as a lower proletariat that would covet but the comfort of the bourgeois interior and its flesh pot horizons. It sounds prophetic. It's like Isaiah, you know? Stay away from the flesh pots, right? It's terrific. And then, I said earlier, you should have said lumpen proletariat. Now he puts lower proletariat. So there's still this kind of idealism in Levinas. That there would be this proletariat that would not see the flesh pots of the bourgeois. And yet most of us are in despair there is no such proletariat. Anyway, okay, so back to page 162. Property, merchandise, the burdened soul. Possession refers to more profound metaphysical relations. A thing does not resist acquisition. The other possessors, those whom one cannot possess, contest and therefore can sanction possession itself. Thus, the possession of things issues in a discourse. The action that is beyond labor, presupposing the absolute resistance of the face of another being, is command and word or the violence of murder. This is so true. I'm sure you've reflected on the nature of a possession. How is it that we possess something? We possess things only by social convention. Right? If you have a car, you own that car because you have the right documents. That's it. Because there is this thing called carjacking. Makes perfect sense. Someone just throws you out of your car, gets in your car, and drives away. Because there's nothing about your relation to your car that is yours, other than documents. Right? So the other is already involved in possession. Right? The recognition that you are the possessor of that possession. Right? Nonetheless, the first, for Levinas, phenomenal appearance of a thing is a possession. Movable goods, property, the regime of property. Okay, let me jump to another topic, and we can come back to everything, and this is fragmented this afternoon. We'll perhaps put it more together. I want to talk a little bit about freedom on page 165. The ambiguity of the body is consciousness. The ambiguity of the body is consciousness. That's on page 165. And we learn what he means by that. The ambiguity of the body is consciousness. On the next page, and he says, on 6 lines down on page 166, to be conscious is precisely to have time. Right? To be conscious is precisely to have time. Not to exceed the present time in the project that anticipates the future, but to have a distance with regard to the present itself. That would be consciousness. And the deeper meaning of that is the postponement of death, what he calls the postponement of death. Right? Now this will not be the deepest sense of time. We're still dealing with, in some manner, imminent time. Imminent time, in addition to being the instant of satisfaction, Levinas revalues this. Remember when I said about contemporary thought is this taking time seriously, and beginning with Bergsson, who showed the reason Zeno's paradoxes arose is because instead of dealing with time, we were dealing with the spatialization of time. We were dealing with stopping points, instants. So you could have 60 instants called minutes in an hour. It doesn't have anything to do with time. It has to do with the movement of a hand on a clock. So then you get this synthetic notion of time, duration in Bergson, expanded by Husserl, expanded by Heidegger. And then Levinas comes back and says, oh no, the instant is part of time. The instant is the moment of enjoyment, independent of past and future, satisfied with itself. So, oh God, this Levinas, you can't, you know, so he brings back the instant, not integrating clock time. Of course, that's not clock time. He's saying the real value of the instant is not what Bergson said when he said it's just spatialized time on clocks. It's that satisfaction of sensing, the instant of satisfaction, the moment of satisfaction. Now he's saying the body is not just instants of satisfaction, which would be a kind of a Cartesian time where it gets created anew every moment. It would be this stretching of time through the postponement of death. I have all this time because I'm not going to die. And then, you know, from the early books in Existence and Resistance, he uses the image of Shakespeare and Macbeth fighting Macduff, and you know, I still have a moment. You know, we'll fight on because you know the last gasp of breath is worth something. You never give up. And then he appropriates the Stoic idea that so long as you're alive, you've got time, and when you're dead, you're not, right? So living is to have time. The ambiguity of the body is consciousness. Consciousness is the idea of having time. And that's the role now of synthetic time, of temporalization, of projection into future, projection in the past. This is ontological time. This is the time of being. I project into the future. I appropriate my past. I can put things in a home. A home is a place where things can endure over time. If I did not have a home, how would things endure over time? The home is the enduring of things over time, the place of the enduring of things over time. It could be something like a heat duct on a street in New York City. Right? It could be a piece of sidewalk. Right? It could be a cardboard box over your head. It's the place where you have time, where you can put things, where you can preserve things. It just could be your pockets. You know, the home is, we have these elaborate bourgeois homes now, thank God, they're wonderful. But the home is much simpler in a certain way. It's the place to put things, to preserve things, to have time, to endure from the elements, to protect. So the body itself, in some way, has this embodiment, this embodiment, this dwelling character. So freedom. I wanted to talk about freedom. Freedom is a difficult concept in Levinas. Freedom, he uses the word difficult. That's his notion of freedom, difficult freedom. Because again, I don't think he's repeating this, but he's breaking out of the antinomy of absolute necessity and absolute freedom, breaking out of determinism versus free will. The will is implicated in what it does. So it's never completely free. But he's not happy with the notion of what he calls finite freedom, which for him comes from Sartre. It comes from an attempt to put together freedom and necessity without fully freeing yourself from the classical heritage, right? So that in Sartre, really, the freedom is pure freedom. There's nothing new in Sartre. It's the oldest philosophy in the world. It's the philosophy of freedom of self-consciousness. That's all. That's why his book is Being and Nothingness. Right? Freedom is nothing, and therefore it's totally free. But for Levinas, no, we start an embodiment. Freedom is not nothing. Freedom is something. Right? So freedom is difficult at best. We're going to see in ethical freedom, but in terms of even the freedom to do anything, freedom, he says, is a relation of life with an other that lodges it. Other in small o, bottom of 165. and by which life is at home with itself. It's not finite freedom, it is virtually a null freedom. Freedom is, as it were, the byproduct of life. It is an adhesion to the world in which it risks being lost its adhesion to the world in which it risks being lost is precisely, and at the same time, that by which it defends itself and is at home with itself. This body, a sector in an elemental reality, is also what permits taking hold of the world, laboring. To be free is to build a world in which one could be free. So freedom is the attempt to remain free. Freedom is not given. In Sartre, it's given. Freedom is something we barely have, and yet we strive to maintain.
I would say it's something that we constantly wrest from the other, so to speak. So it's to be free. It's not a fact. It's not an attribute, but it's a continuous struggle
Yes.
against everything else.
Mhm.
Finally, it's a continuous struggle which can never reach an end,
Mhm.
which can never reach fulfillment. You can never end up being completely free.
No, unless there's some abstraction. Absolutely. It's always threatened too.
Yeah.
It's never given. Have you noticed the difference if you go into a small room, if you in a hotel setting, you have a small room as opposed to a hotel with a large room? Right? Why do you feel more free in a large room and less free in a small room? We all experience it. Freedom is a struggle to be free. Now, of course, we're living in a world where it's gone crazy, where people have 40,000 square meter houses, and it's insane, right? But you can see the impulse behind it, right? What is Bill Gates has a house? It's a monster. So how big is it? It's absurd. It's got bowling alleys he's never even been to, right? Swimming pools. Is there a swimming pool here? Yes, it's an engaged, it's an embodied freedom, and we have to rethink the whole idea of freedom now, and how little really free we are, and how precious it is that we have the freedom we do have.
He said here is this freedom is a relation of life with another. I think this freedom is the relation we have with the family.
Well, the other here, I'm thinking he's thinking of the materiality of the world.
I think it's the family because at home you don't have a real material because everything is with this intimacy with the family. So it's nothing is pure material. At home,
Right.
the elements they are already been like granted by the woman, and the flags they are already been fabricated by the woman. So I think for me, I don't know what he means by another here, but for me it's the feminine, and that's like logistics.
The feminine.
Yeah.
I don't know why it
Because
would
it's at
be
home.
specifically the feminine. Does he say that?
somewhere
Does he say that?
Julian is woman, the women.
Yeah, he
Oh,
said-
yeah, he does say
Yeah,
the
he
thing about
does
women.
say
I want to
the
get to
women,
that.
yeah, that's the key word.
But I want to get to that.
The Julians, the women's.
Yeah, I remember that.
How can you have that sense of home without women?
Yeah, it's actually in.
Yeah, but remember, he says right at the beginning, let's someone we're clear, he says right at the beginning of his analysis of the feminine and woman, that he does not mean biologically a
No,
female.
no.
Right, okay.
You're talking about the women with capital W,
Yeah.
that sense of women.
No, I mean here just like the intimacy, like at home means
Yes,
like
yes, yes.
the intimacy, the gentleness, the warmth you have. So it's that's freedom, like.
Yeah, but freedom is
At home.
never, but freedom is never absolute. Absolutely.
No,
So-
of course it's not absolute, it's not finite. It's just a now freedom because you are at home.
Okay, yeah, page
There's no-
155.
I'm saying, okay. So, but
Page 155, the third paragraph,
in the middle,
um,
yeah.
somewhere, line
Right in
5
the
on the
middle.
bottom.
Yep.
And the other whose presence is incredibly and absent, with which is accomplished.
Accomplish the primary
Primacy
hospital.
must be welcome. And especially the field of intimacy is the women. Yeah, that's the thing.
It's now it's
The
now
women is the
freedom.
condition of
Only
the
the
collection
freedom.
interiority of the home
Right.
and habitation.
Yeah. It's now freedom because you don't need the freedom actually. You're at home. No one is going to bound you. So that's why it's now freedom.
But here's the difficulty, is that when we're going to get on Thursday to the
Yeah.
encounter with the face of the other,
Yeah.
in a certain way, we're the least free of all. That is, for them now,
Yeah, with
responsibility
the
is
other.
almost
Yeah,
unfree.
But at home you are free, but it doesn't matter because it's not a freedom for them. Because real freedom for you is like it's with the real other. But here with the feminine, it's free, but it's now freedom. He said it's now freedom. Why is now freedom? It doesn't matter. You're at home. The other is absent. The woman is not there. You think you are free, but she's not there. There's no. It's not a real relation with the other. So it seems to be
But
free.
you're not hearing what I'm saying. I'm saying that the odd thing is,
Yeah.
when we are in relation to the other,
Yeah.
is when we are least free.
Yeah.
So
It's
how
real.
can you be saying that in the home,
Yeah.
we're not free because we're not in relationship with the other?
Yeah.
Because when we're in relation to the
Yeah.
other,
We are not
we're
free.
least free.
Yeah, we're not free because there's no problem with freedom because you feel like free because it's the woman. She gives you everything.
So you have the freedom because of the woman, you're saying?
Yeah, but it's not real freedom because the real freedom is based
Oh, it's
on.
not ethical freedom,
Yeah,
right, it's not
it's not
responsible
ethical.
freedom.
Yeah, it's only at home.
Yes.
It's a now
Yes, no,
freedom.
I don't disagree
Being
with that.
chez soi. It's, you're at ease, you're,
Right,
you know,
Yeah, it's
you're-
now freedom. It's a now.
right, you're at ease, the freedom of that sense, that walking into a large room rather than a small room, you're
Yeah,
free in the
yeah.
sense you're not confined. But Levinas is saying that this postponement, this is a kind of freedom. This is the space of freedom. But it's not absolute. It's not pure. It's not null, but it's not much.
But he said it's a now freedom. So
No, where does he say null freedom?
we just read it.
Yeah.
Oh, right here.
Yeah.
Let's see. The other presence is there was the absence. The Department of Hospitality. Welcome. Just trying to
No,
fill in.
the original.
Oh, the original one.
Yeah, 167.
That was
165.
165.
Yeah, it's
It
like
is virtually enough
And
freedom.
not
you
freedom.
say.
Yeah, that's different. Virtually.
Well, I
To be
think,
fr- It's virtually. That's not null.
a now freedom.
but I think that what he's trying to do what he's trying to say when he talks about no
Oh,
freedom.
virtually a null freedom. That's the very difference. It's not null freedom and virtually a null freedom are not the
Means
same.
It is almost enough freedom.
Almost a null freedom. Null freedom, right, that's different.
Yeah, but the question is, what is actually null freedom? What is he trying to say to us through null freedom? I don't think he's trying to say it's no freedom. I think what he's trying to say is that this is the 0 point of freedom. Having a house enables us to be free, and this is a very Aristotelian idea, because for Aristotle, to be able to take part to the public life, you had to possess a home, you had to possess an oikos. This is what it was so important, to have your money, to have your slaves, but you wouldn't bother doing the business. Somebody would do this for you, and this was what gave you the right to appear in the public life, to interact with the other. So this is the null freedom, is the 0 point of freedom, is where freedom starts. The home is what allows you to be free. You need a home in order to be free. You need to be enclosed in order to open yourself up to the world, so to speak.
I don't disagree with anything you said, but I don't think the word null here means the 0 point. See what I'm saying? I think you're right, but I don't think in this expression, I think he actually means virtually a null freedom in the sense is, this is barely what we would call freedom in the ordinary sense. That is, Levinas is the philosopher who is opposing totality, where people are defined by their place in a system. You would think the way out of totality would be freedom, because Spinoza and Nietzsche, in the name of totality, deny freedom. They go that far. There is no freedom. Only a philosopher could say that, right? So you would think Levinas's recourse is going to be freedom. But no, he doesn't go there. He's saying freedom is almost null. The alternative is responsibility, which is even less free than this virtual freedom. So the alternative is, we could call it, it's hard to come up with how to call it, the initiative of response, the generosity, the giving of response, which is under the compulsion, hopefully, of the other. So he's being clever, I think. He's not taking the easy way of freedom. But I just wanted, I'm not disagreeing about the need to
I
hold,
understand.
but I'm just saying
I
that
understand
I think in this expression, he just wants to temper us, and he's not taking that cheap way out, like, oh yeah, freedom, we're all free. Like, Sartre is by definition free. What kind of freedom is that?
I agree with you. He's trying to say that freedom is not granted as such. It's
It's not granted as such.
One thing, maybe I misheard, you said responsibility is the opposite of freedom. Which,
I'm saying it's perhaps the least free moment.
but I think about this, maybe there's no contradiction here.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about this in terms of Kant and Kierkegaard, of course. And in Kant, you are free, and only by being free you can choose the duty. You can choose to be dutiful. And the
Right.
same in Kierkegaard. And in Kierkegaard, what I think is important, he distinguishes two freedoms: the freedom of the esthete, which is basically having the array of possibilities.
Yeah.
And
Temptation of temptation, that's what
exactly. Yeah. And the ethical person is the one who understands that there's only one choice.
Yes,
Being
that's like Levinas.
having ethical duty and
Right.
basically taking up or not. And
Right.
and there the striving also enters, which we just spoke a little bit about as well.
Right.
So being free is to be ethical, and to be ethical is to always try to be ethical.
Yes.
And that's the freedom, which is very limited freedom. Somehow it's conditioned freedom. It's conditioned in the sense that, well, you basically don't have a choice. You
You're
kind
talking
of
about
have.
the Vedas.
Now, I'm talking about Kierkegaard, but I think it's very similar to what he's trying to say
No,
here.
he's saying like to be free is to build a world. It's totally different. And he
Well-
said it's not finite freedom. It's Levinas. You don't
He's not.
confuse with other people.
Well, first of all, what
Yeah.
Victor is distinguishing is the freedom of the aesthete, which is the temptation of temptation, which is to be so free that you've chosen nothing.
Yeah.
And he's distinguishing that from the ethical freedom of either or, where you're compelled. And I think both of these things are in line with
But
everything else.
there's
But you
no
are right too, there's this dimension of a very limited, of virtually no freedom, of creating a world where it can be just. But let me add something here, because it has to be said. Where are we free in Levinas? In representation. That's the domain of freedom. Representation. And it's representation that creates a just world. So he just wants to say that, yes, labor and possession, and it's a limited kind of freedom, it's embodied, it's, you're also betrayed by your body and betrayed by your works, and can be taken advantage by your exposure in the world. There's an ambiguity of the body, it's both a subject and an object at the same time, and it is that ambiguity. But where does freedom come? Representation. Because and representation is one of the great dangers. It's actually an aesthetic danger, because it's this. He says it's to be. Look how he defines representation. It's just this wild definition of representation. Hold on. Page 170. We have defined, bottom paragraph, first sentence, 170. We have defined representation as a determination of the other by the same, without the same being determined by the other. Representation, 172 on the top, derives its freedom with regard to the world that nourishes it. That is, representation creates a distance so that I can tell you how the world is without the world affecting me. I am now in the impersonality of the transcendental ego. I am not my own ego.
It's a bad freedom.
What?
It's a bad freedom.
It is a necessary,
Necessary,
it's
but I don't
necessary
know.
for justice.
There's his contemporaries who hung out with, the guy up in Marcel,
Ah, yes.
take this, going back to Schelling and indirectly to Kant, is make a distinction between freedom from and freedom for.
Yeah, that's a basic distinction.
And we're talking about separation here, so the dwelling, Sartre talks about this in the better parts of Being Nothingness, where possession is a way I defend myself and my freedom against others, but the ethical move is this, I try to represent a world where No, I get beyond that. So it's yeah, you have to keep those, but they're necessary to each other.
Yes.
You have to have the freedom from first, or you'd never make the second decision, is what Marcel called primary and secondary reflection.
See, I think of this distinction, freedom from, freedom for, from T.H. Green, and of course, freedom from is that abstract representational freedom for him, and freedom for are to establish the conditions that make that freedom possible. So that for me, freedom for, and I think is this different than yours? Freedom for would be the material conditions, and then justice creating the material conditions for freedom from.
Yeah, what Marcel does in primary and secondary reflection is, primary reflection is where I break myself off from the world.
And what are you calling that? Freedom?
Freedom from. I'm free from the, it's freedom from the
Right,
world.
okay, yes.
Or what Schelling calls it,
And freedom
the
from.
will of the basis.
Right, and freedom for is establishing the conditions that make that possible.
Yes.
Yes, okay, we're using it the same way. Right, right. And it's in Eric Fromm. That's, you know, that book by Eric Fromm on freedom. Yeah. Yeah, that's essential. It's big, it's a whole political thing. It's in Frankfurt School.
But I mean,
No,
seems
it's
to be what's
good.
going on here.
I think it's a basically Spinozistic distinction between positive and negative freedom. So the negative freedom is freedom for, and the positive freedom is freedom to. And this is
Yes.
is reflected in his
Right.
ethics and the way he.
And his attempt to rethink that without the abstractions of dualism.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right?
that's
And
important.
that's the whole key. That's why it's so difficult to think it. And that's why he wants to call it virtually null freedom. Because in comparison to the freedom of representation, it is virtually null. And what is the whole temptation of the aesthetic life is this abstract freedom. You know, that I'm never affected. In Levinas's term, that would be representational freedom. Because I am never really affected. Nothing ever changes me. It's a game, life's a play. And I escape it all the time. And I devise the most ridiculous methods so that it doesn't affect me. Like, what is it, like focusing on the drop of sweat on the nose in either or, the SD. You said if you're really bored, watch a person sweat. You know, it's just all these little
Or
techniques.
seduce someone, yeah.
Or seduce someone. All right, seduction is the perfect temptation of temptation. Right?
Would you say that this virtually null freedom is actually the negative freedom? Is the freedom from everything else when you're at home?
No, I was thinking of the virtually null freedom as the positive. Yeah, I was thinking of that as positive. Yeah. What I'm thinking was negative is the representational freedom. Yeah. But it's necessary to create a just world. That's the beauty. You need that freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of press. You need that to create. You need knowledge. Knowledge is based on that freedom. You know, that's why knowledge is funny. We'll take a break right after we finish this talk. We'll come back and continue it. But there's this funny thing about art that we indulge these artists. They live these lives that are despicable, and we go, but we have these works of art, right? And we somehow excuse them. And in the same way, it's true of intellectuals and scientists, right? We have these despicable lives, and then we go, yes, but the theory of relativity. You know, it's worth it. The theory of relativity. Yes, he beat up his wife. Or then people do this with Heidegger, right? Yeah, he treated his wife like garbage. Well, look what he did to Hannah Arendt. Being in time. You know, it's like you cannot say anything because we're going to take a break, and then you can say something. And then say something. Okay, let's take a break.